Batman has arguably one of the best rogues gallery of all time, right there next to Spider-Man. If you were to ask anyone who doesn't read a comic book just on the street who Batman's best villain was, they'd probably say the Joker. That might be due to the popularity of the movies and everything, but you get what I'm saying. Everyone knows who a lot of the Batman supervillains are. The same exact thing goes for Spider-Man villains. Last week I made a Mount Rushmore video seeing who the fourth member of Spider-Man's supervillains were on a Mount Rushmore list. Obviously the Green Goblin, Venom, and Doc Ock were the first three, but who deserved that fourth spot? This week I'm doing quite literally like the inverse or the opposite of that, but with Batman villains. Everyone knows the Joker deserves a spot on that list as number one. It's not even a question. But who is second, third, and fourth on that list? There's honestly a lot of great arguments for a lot of different characters who deserve to be on this list, and I'm going to use the same three questions that I used to find out who deserves the fourth spot on last week's video for the Spider-Man villains. And if you haven't seen that, I'll link it right now, or it'll be in the description below. I'm going to use those same three questions and a few other ones that I have to determine who deserves the final spot on this list of Batman villains. So who were Batman's oldest and original villains that he faced in the comics? Well, his very first villain that he fought in May of 1939, in the case of the Chemical Syndicate, was Alfred Stryker, I believe, and he was just a corrupt businessman attempting to eliminate his partners to gain full control of their company. Very low stakes stuff, which does not help our argument in question here at all. Secondly, in June of 1939, just 1 month later, Frenchie Blake's Jewel Gang was the title of the comic, where Batman fought, you guessed it, Frenchie Blake, who leads a gang of jewel thieves, and the story is Batman fighting just a straightforward crime gang. Again, this is not helping anything because these are not common villains nowadays. Number 3, in the next month in 1939, Batman fights Dr. Death and Batman meets Dr. Death. This is actually Batman's first reoccurring supervillain, who's just a mad scientist who is using poison to blackmail wealthy victims. Again, Dr. Death isn't really that common nowadays, even though in the next comic, again in August of 1939, it's literally called The Return of Dr. Death. So that's 2 on the board for Dr. Death. But as we're going to see later, this guy is not relevant, so it's not really helping our case here. And speaking of that, next month in September of 1936 is Batman versus the Monk, who is like a vampire-like villain. So this was a bust. I mean, last week when I did the Spider-Man villains, some of the first villains that he fought in the comics were the Lizard, Rhino, Vulture, Electro, Green Goblin, who are all now mainstay Spider-Man villains. So what happened with the Batman villains? Because this is not working. Well, to my knowledge, back when they were originally doing the Batman villains in Detective Comics, before Batman really took off, these villains were just kind of run-of-the-mill Batman fights local street crimes like the Blake Jewel Gang stuff. It wasn't until a few issues later that you finally see these mainstay villains that we all know and love now actually being relevant in the Batman comic. So let's go break down who appeared not first in Batman comics, but which of Batman's arguably known rogues gallery villains appeared first in the comics. Which the first one was later on, again in 1939, we see Joe Chill in November. I'm not going to really add him to the list because that's like, is he the Joker sometimes? Is he not? He's definitely not on the Mount Rushmore list. Someone that I don't think is going to be on the list, but is a good contender for a rogues gallery villain, is the next year. In 1940, we see Hugo Strange. And then right after that, in April of 1940, we see one of our most popular and mainstay villains and contender for this list, Catwoman. So it's a point on the board for Catwoman. Just a few issues later, again in April of 1940, the Joker makes his first appearance, and obviously he's going to be on the list, so let's just keep going. Clayface in June of 1940. Scarecrow pops up September of 1941, a whole year later. Right after that, in December of 1941, we see the Penguin, and then Two-Face in August of 1942. Then Solomon Grundy, another contender in 1944. And then finally, we're going to stop with this comic list at the Riddler in 1948. The drastic change of the Riddler being in 1948 to almost a whole decade prior of Joe Chill being in November of 1939, Batman's villains didn't really come up in popularity as fast as Spider-Man's villains did, to my knowledge, especially in the comics, which, to be fair, doesn't really help my argument with the rhetoric and the rules that I've put forward in the first Spider-Man villain that I did for the Mount Rushmore series. So ending with the comics, let's go into my second question of what Batman villains are in the stories that are the most well-regarded and received comics for Batman. That being things like The Dark Knight, Killing Joke, Nightfall, stuff like that. What Batman comics are the most well-regarded and fan favorites, and what villains are in those comics, to help further the question and add to the list of potential villains for the Mount Rushmore list. After scouring the internet, I have what I think is the top 5 most popular and well-regarded Batman comics. You could interchange a few of these for other ones, but from what I've seen, this is what seems to be like the top 5 in most of the fans' opinions. Starting with number 5, we're going to have Batman Nightfall. This is the most iconic story of featuring Bane, where he breaks Batman's back in half, which was adapted later in Dark Knight Returns. Number 4 being one of my favorite Batman comics of all time, and they even have an animated movie based on this, which some people like, some people don't. I like it. That, of course, being Batman The Long Halloween. The villain in that is, some people think it's the Calendar Man, some people think it's Catwoman. It goes back and forth. It's actually Alberto Falcone, who is the son of Carmine Falcone, which is not really a mainstake Batman villain, but this is a great comic. So we're going to mention Alberto Falcone, but I'm just going to let you know right now he's not making it to the Mount Rushmore list. Third, we have, you guessed it, the Killing Joke, which is the Joker. I'm not really going to go into too much depth about that. It's in the name, the Joker. Yeah, Joker's on this list. Number 2, we have Batman Year One, which also has an animated movie, which is awesome. And the overall villain for this was a lot of small crime gangs, because, I mean, it's Batman in year 1 of him being Batman. But the overall villain, if you'll call it, was Selina Kyle's Catwoman, so another point for Catwoman on the list. Lastly, one of the most well-regarded Batman comics of all time. We could throw in the Death in the Family, stuff like that, which you could say it's Jason Todd or it's Joker. I'm putting The Dark Knight Returns, which, again, it's a great comic, a great animated movie adaptation, but, again, the main villain is the Joker. This is making the list really hard to kind of compile what villains deserve to be on this list. Right now, out of the top 5 comic books that I have for Batman, the Joker was the villain for 2 of them, one of them being Alberto Falcone, who's not making it to the list. So, again, we're kind of spinning our wheels here. Let's go to my third question, which is, who are the main villains in the live adaptation Batman movies? Because whether you like it or not as a comic book or superhero fan, a lot of the average people, myself included if I'll be honest, the villains and the character popularity of the superheroes, it's mainly based on the movies and what is in pop culture. A lot of people thought Sam Raimi's Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, they just thought due to that movie that Spider-Man, and I did as well as a little kid, I thought Spider-Man always shot webs out of his wrist because of that movie. Turns out, no, that's not what happens. That happened like once or twice in a Spider-Man comic, and fans hated it. Spider-Man always creates his own web shooters. Well, whether you like it or not, a lot of fans' perceptions of comic book characters, and especially villains, has to do with what they were portrayed as in the movies. That being said, who were the most popular and most reoccurring villains in Batman movies? Starting off with the very first live-action Batman movie, that being in 1943, just called Batman. I've never seen this movie, and I'll watch it eventually because it has a successor being Batman and Robin just a few years later in 1949. But the first villain of Batman in 1943 was a guy named Dr. Daka, or Daka, D-A-K-A. He was a wartime propaganda villain from what I've seen, him being this Japanese, like, mad scientist, which is very strange nowadays when we think about it. Long story short, he was a largely obscure Batman villain that is not popular anymore, and I think he's made an appearance in like 1 or 2 one-off comics. So yeah, Dr. Daka, we're not adding him to the Mount Rushmore list. Secondly, we have the Wizard. That was in Batman and Robin, the successor to Batman movie in 1949. The Wizard was just a masked criminal with advanced technology that included a device that can remote control vehicles and machineries. The Wizard was never a villain before this movie, and he was created purely for the Batman and Robin movie in 1949, and he has not appeared in any other adaptation of the character in comics or movies, so we're just going to scratch that again. Let's go to the more popular Batman movies, that of course being 1966, The Batman, who has the Joker as the main villain. This is with Adam West, the really campy one where the Joker rides a surfboard, I believe, and you also have Catwoman, Riddler, Penguin, and this is kind of just a mashup of the most popular characters from the TV show at the time, but this is where we're starting to see the more popular characters. This is the first appearance of the Riddler and the Penguin, and also Catwoman and the Joker, but mainly the Riddler and the Penguin being popular characters outside of comic books. Of course, when we jump straight to 1989, we see Jack Nicholson's The Joker. This is again reintroducing into the public conscious that the Joker is Batman's main villain, so this really doesn't help. Moving on to Batman Returns in 1992, we see the Penguin and Catwoman being the main villains of this movie, which this movie is a fever dream, but that's a video for another time. Jumping to the next movie in this list, 1995, Batman Forever, we see the Riddler and Two-Face. This movie is insane. The Riddler, again, making another appearance, who is starting to collect points for this list. Also, Two-Face appearing for the first time in live action. Whether you like or hate this adaptation, he was in it. Speaking of liking or hating adaptations, the next horrible, awful fever dream movie in this list is Batman and Robin. That being with Mr. Freeze, Poison Ivy, and Bane being the main villains in this movie. So we're starting to see a more diverse cast of Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze, who are well-regarded comic book characters, and still are, but these are one of their only live-action adaptations of the characters, so remember that moving forward when we don't see them ever again, and why they will not be a main stake on this list as villains. Jumping into the more recent and well-regarded Batman movies, that being Batman Begins, we see Ra's al Ghul, or Ra's al Ghul, however you want to say it, and the Scarecrow, which Scarecrow is finally making his way into a live-action adaptation. I think there's a very good argument for him being on this list, not just because this was his first ever appearance in live action, but throughout all of the Arkham games, he is a central theme, the Scarecrow being this horrifying villain. He was a huge part of Batman the Animated Series, and the fact that we only have one live-action adaptation of him honestly makes me sad. Moving on to The Dark Knight, obviously that's the Joker. Heath Ledger's performance is extremely iconic, and we have Two-Face. So another point on the board for Two-Face. Again, we have Joker, who we're not even going to talk about because he's obviously on this list. Capping off the Christopher Nolan trilogy, we have The Dark Knight Rises, with Bane being the main villain, with Catwoman also making an appearance, and Talia al Ghul. This is again one of Batman's more iconic villains, but he's only appeared twice in live action, which is pretty interesting to me. But keep in mind, this is also another appearance of Catwoman, who is a huge character in all of Batman media, so keep that in mind moving forward. Going into a movie that I really don't even want to talk about, that being Batman vs. Superman. We have Lex Luthor, Doomsday, and Superman. We're just going to move on because this movie was terrible. And then my favorite all-time Batman movie, capping off with the most recent one, that being The Batman in 2022. We see characters, again, like Catwoman, the Riddler, and the Penguin. I'm gonna be honest, I think the Penguin deserves a spot on this list purely, not because of the TV show, but the fact, like, I think the TV show that came out with him more recently jumped and elevated his character so far into the public conscious, is that as long as they don't fumble the bag moving forward with the Penguin, he's going to be in talks. Right there with Heath Ledger's adaptation of the Joker, I think Colin Farrell's Penguin is in that same conversation moving forward, especially with live-action Batman villains. I'm just going to go ahead and throw the Penguin into the top contender of being on this list. So that wraps up all of Batman's villains in his live-action movies, and we still really don't have a list, which is really interesting because last week when we did the Spider-Man villains, this was very quick. You saw characters like the Lizard, Doc Ock, Green Goblin, Sandman, Electro repeat over and over again. And when you match that with their early adaptations in the comic books, you see, okay, these characters that have appeared in live action and have appeared in the comic books, of course they're going to be on this list. But with Batman, we don't really have that. We see the same few characters appear, but we have a huge list of honorable mentions that I want to get through that deserve to be at least brought up in this conversation. Number one, in my opinion, who I think his more iconic adaptation was in actually the Lego Batman game, that being Clayface. I know he had a huge arc and was a huge contender in Batman the Animated Series, but I know him more from the Lego Batman game. But we have Clayface. Then we have Harley Quinn, who is obviously a huge character throughout the comics and has now stepped away from being like Joker's assistant to being her own character. She has her own TV show. She's been in Birds of Prey. She was in Suicide Squad 1 and 2. She was in the Batman the Animated Series and a lot of the animated movies moving forward. I think she deserves a spot in this conversation, even though her live-action appearances have they've been really strong, but they haven't been any Batman-adjacent movies. Two characters that have had live-action interpretations, but they've just been awful, but have had great animated adaptations, that being Killer Croc and Solomon Grundy, who was born on a Monday. They're not going to be on this list, but I couldn't not mention them. And then two that I think obviously are going to be number 1 and 2, or I guess 2 and 3 on this list, because the Joker's obviously going to be number 1. I'm going to give it to Kite Man and Condiment King. After all of that being said, I'm pretty sure I have who I want to put on this list, but really quickly, one last thing. Batman the Animated Series is such an iconic masterpiece that has impacted so many different aspects of the characters, so it would pain me to at least not acknowledge some of the more popular and iconic villains from that series that even facilitated a question or an argument or a conversation for this list. That being said, Mr. Freeze, Two-Face, Poison Ivy, Harley Quinn, Penguin, Riddler, Joker, Scarecrow, Clayface, all these characters that we haven't really seen as much in live action. The reason that they're in this conversation, in my opinion, isn't even because of the comics. It's purely because of this show. That being said, I had to mention them in the honorable mentions list. And finally, who am I going to put on this list? Number 1, Joker. No one's going to question that. In no particular order for slots 2, 3, and 4, I have the Riddler, the Penguin, and Catwoman. These characters in their live action appearances are a mainstay that over and over each adaptation of Batman has these characters, or at least a form of them or a hint. And yeah, they've changed in different interpretations, and that's awesome, and I love that. But I think Batman wouldn't be Batman without these characters. As I was making this list, I had characters like Bane, Scarecrow, Two-Face, Harley Quinn, Poison Ivy that I wanted to put in this list because of how popular they've gotten in more recent years, but I couldn't do it. I think Catwoman, the Riddler, Penguin, and Joker are who deserve to be on this list. Honestly, you could interchange Catwoman for Harley Quinn in terms of them being Batman villains that also aren't really villains. Like Harley Quinn used to be just the Joker's like sidekick or assistant, but now she is her own thing. Some interpretations, she's not even a villain. So, I mean, she's definitely interchangeable on this list. And I think you could make the argument for Scarecrow being there instead of the Riddler. But me personally, I love the Riddler. I think his adaptation in the Batman just absolutely skyrocketed the character's popularity. But for no argument at all, I think the Penguin has to at least be on this list. But me personally, I'm throwing Joker, Riddler, Penguin, and Catwoman on this list. But ultimately, what do you guys think? Do you guys think that this was a good list? Who would you put on there? Don't even say not the Joker because I won't take your comments seriously. But seriously, I really like these videos. The one that I made about Spider-Man, I'm trying to scroll through and comment and reply and like as many comments as I can. You guys absolutely blew that video up. And thank you guys so much from the bottom of my heart. Genuinely, thank you so much. I love being able to make these videos and interact with you guys because it's fun. I enjoy it. And very obviously, you guys enjoy it too. So again, thank you guys so much. Who would you guys put on this list? Who would you take out? Or did I hit this right on the head and absolutely knock it out of the park? Let me know you guys' comments and thoughts on the videos below. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you haven't already, please like the video. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing if you like this type of content. It just helps me know you guys like this content, obviously, and I'll keep making more because of it. As always, guys, take care, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.